Good evening and welcome to the May 23rd, 2022 Prince George's County Historical Society History Chat, Digging into History. I'm Donna Schneider, President of the Society. We are recording the History Chat if you hadn't already heard, so we would appreciate it if you would mute your microphones if you're not speaking. We will be recording tonight's session, and it'll appear on our YouTube channel over the weekend, so you can find if you enjoyed this so much you need to watch it again, you can find it on our YouTube channel. We will be answering questions at the end. And so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. So tonight's conversation is with Kristin Montaperto, who's the Chief Archaeologist, and Jennifer Stabler, who's the Archaeology Planner, both with Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And they will be talking to us about Mount Calvert and a few other county sites that are also owned by Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. So a little bit about Kristin. Dr. Montaperto is the Archaeology Manager and Chief Archaeologist for the Natural and Historic Resources Division of Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Department of Parks and Recreation in Prince George's County. Glad I don't have to say that 3 times fast. She received her PhD in anthropology from American University and has worked for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission for 20 years. Her primary research focus is public outreach to diverse populations and collaborating with local communities on archaeological projects in the Middle Atlantic region. Dr. Montaperto will discuss some of the significant archaeological discoveries within the parks and the important work her office conducts to share the history of Prince George's County to the communities. And our moderator tonight is Dr. Jennifer Stabler, who you may remember from one of our history chats last year. I want to say it was the March one. She is a planner 4 in the historic preservation section of the Prince George's County Planning Department. She reviews development applications for potential impacts to archaeological resources on developing properties and makes recommendations to the county planning board. Her recommendations include if a developing property should be surveyed for archaeological resources and whether significant sites should be preserved in place or further studied prior to development. Dr. Stabler received her PhD from the University of Maryland, and she has participated in archaeological investigations in Maryland, Texas, Virginia, Israel, Jordan, and Italy. So welcome to both of you, and Jennifer, I'll let you take over.
All righty. Thank you, Donna, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Tonight, Dr. Montaperto and I will be talking about some of the archaeological investigations that have been conducted on some of our park properties. I tried to pick several of our park properties are also county historic sites. And so we'll just hear from Dr. Montaperto about the finds from these various excavations, and I guess we'll go from there. So the first site that we're going to talk about is one that Dr. Montaperto wrote her dissertation on, Northampton slave quarters. And so Kristin, why don't you go ahead and talk to us, tell us about your findings at Northampton and your collaboration with the community on this project.
Great. Thank you, John Peter and Donna, for reaching out. And thank you, Jennifer, for helping moderate, I guess, as you will, today. So thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and to talk about some of the amazing work that we are doing at some of these significant sites within Prince George's County. So as Jennifer said, the first site that I'm going to talk about is the Northampton Slave Quarters and Archaeological Park. And this site is a very unique site. And what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to share my screen to sort of help illustrate the uniqueness of this site. So if you can give me 1 minute and I will do that. So hopefully this should be popping up. Okay. So if you look at this slide, you can see that there is this, and hopefully my cursor is going to be cooperative. Okay. So you can see this entire green section here and this green section here. So this is highlighting what is property within the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. This is park property. And one of the unique situations with this park is you can see it's smack in the middle of a housing development. And one of the interesting things that happened here is in the process of developing these houses that are around it over here to the north side. One of the interesting things that happened is in the process of doing that, they were required to do archaeology prior to that work. And during that, they found in this larger green section right here, and I think it's approximately right where my cursor is right now, was a house. It was just the foundations existed, and there were a couple other remains of buildings that they found on the property. And what was discovered were these were the remains of the original plantation house on this property. That was called Northampton. It was about 1,000 acres. And that was granted back in the late 1600s. What happened was, as part of this development, the developer was required to turn over a certain percentage of property, had to go back to the parkland, to open space and things like that. And it happened that it was this approximate 11-acre parcel, again, just this one right here, that was turned over. Then later, when they started doing the development of these townhouses, and those are the ones that are down here that are surrounding this small little half-acre section. And in the process of doing the development of those townhouses, additional archaeology was being done, and they found the foundations of 2 former slave quarters. Again, it was just the foundations of these quarters that were located. And one of the unique things that barely ever happens, but Jennifer and I and other archaeologists are thrilled when this happens, is the developer actually gave us, being the commission, this half-acre parcel. They were under no obligation to do that, but it was realized how significant these 2 structures were, and the fact that we already had this other section on this larger parcel that was also part of it. So they gave us this half-acre. So we have about 12 acres total now with those 2 parcels. You can see that there's a small little connection right here that's also park property. And by doing that, the developer actually had to slightly redesign the form of those townhouses. So they actually lost pretty much like a row of townhouses that were going to go right here. So again, something very surprising that the developer did. But what was unique during the process of that is that this was in the 80s, like mid to late 80s. And so when this small parcel where the quarters were found, and here's an example of one that we restored, we reconstructed just the foundation of it. And at the exact same time, the family associated, the descendant African-American family associated with potentially the enslaved that were here. And the reason I'm only saying potential is because they all descend from Elizabeth Hawkins. And yes, she would have been enslaved, just we're trying to make that connection if it actually was at this site. And they all associate with Elizabeth Hawkins. And again, when these quarters were found, the family at the same time was in the process of researching more about their history. They connected with our office, and what was super unique and amazing about this site is the creation of this park, the telling of the story of these people's history coincided. And so they were a huge collaborative part of the creation of this park. to the point that the developer, who was supposed to assist with reconstructing the foundations of the 2 quarters. And again, in this image, you can only see the brick foundation. There was a brick quarter. Behind this larger sign right here is a frame quarter. It would have had a stone foundation and it would have been wooden from there. And unfortunately, the developer went under, was unable to help with paying for the reconstruction of these 2 buildings. We're able to help with one of them. And because we had such this active family that was involved in the process of digging with us on the site, in the process of, telling their history to school students, they actually went and helped with getting us a grant to actually finish the rest of this park and have it as it is today, which is an open air park with these 2 foundations and interpretive signs around it. So that is, and what I'm going to do right now is take that off so I can see everybody better. And so that was one of the things that was super unique about this site is, again, the developer did not expect to see this. And then all of a sudden we found these quarters the same time that, the family members were trying to learn more about their history. So it's sort of what like this, fantastic matchup of, us trying to interpret this and then having the family there to help us through this process. One of the interesting things about this site is that it doesn't end there with the descendant interest. So although the individuals that were very active at the beginning, some of them we have lost, gosh, oh my goodness. I think one of the women who is the family historian, she's probably in her early 90s now, maybe. So one of the things is we still have members of the descendant family that live in the DC, Prince George's area. There's a contingent in Pennsylvania, in the Philly area. But one of the interesting things, I will randomly get phone calls with people that have made the connection to the descendant African-American family. And in fact, I just received one of these a couple of weeks ago. And so with her, I think we're still trying to make the connection, like where she is in the family. But again, randomly, I'll go like maybe a couple years and we'll find somebody else that might be connected. And what I've been able to do with some of these descendants is put them in contact with the families that live here. And so they've been able to create those connections, which has, it's been great for the descendants that we already know about and the ones we're learning, and then meeting new family members and, trying to establish these connections and everything. So that has been super, that has been an amazing part of this project, is just the family and seeing these people, various different people coming out and trying to learn more. Another thing related to, I know Jennifer, you also said community. One of the interesting things about the community is in the picture that I showed you, we're this park is smack in the middle of a housing development, right? And so you would think, okay, what's the involvement with the people that are right around you? Well, as the park was being excavated, we were learning more about it. We did have interactions with the homeowners that were around this community because, think about it, you're brand new to this area. You just moved into your house. At the same time you're moving in, you see these archaeologists digging in this park right near you and, just trying to figure out what's going on. And so people would come and visit the archaeologists when they were working. They'd ask questions. A couple volunteered. And then you have, time that passes and people that were original to that neighborhood moving out and new families coming in. And that immediate surrounding community not having that same connection with this site, that the other community members, they grew up as the site was being rediscovered. And one of the interesting things that happened, and I believe this was at the beginning of the pandemic, is the president of the HOA reached out. And it was completely related to an issue that they were having related to water and trying to remedy a situation with water. And it was through that a new connection was made with the homeowners association there. Since then, I've been in contact with them. The president and the members of the community that actively serve on the board, reached out for me to give a talk to them at one of their homeowners association meetings. We did that. We even developed a special program just for the homeowners last early July. We did a special program for them. And one of the exciting things that we just did is we repointed. So we fixed that brick that was starting to fall apart, because again, these buildings, the foundations, we reconstructed them back in the late 80s, early 90s, probably 90s is a little bit more accurate. And so it's been a couple of decades, and they needed, a little bit more TLC. And so we just finished a repointing project. So all of the brick has been replaced that has, gone away. The stones have been cleaned up a little bit. And so, just staying in touch with that community that is seeing this work being done, and, waiting for the next call to start doing some more talks and stuff that we've sort of, been talking about on the side. So that actually has been fantastic, sort of seeing, again, another shift with communities asking questions and wanting to get involved in the history. So there definitely at this park has been this ebb and flow, through time, with interest loss. But again, that could be just related to, daily life, too many other things going on. But yeah, so that has been a fascinating resurgence, I guess you could say, of attention to the park and its site.
Yeah, thanks, Kristin. This has been a very good example of how archaeology, a project where an archaeology site was found, and connecting that site to the community, interpreting it to the community, talking to the community, getting them involved, tracking down family members who may be associated with that site. And so this is like a really good example of, this is one of the reasons I do archaeology, because it's connecting people with the past. And this is a very good example of how that's been successful in the context of a housing development.
Yeah, and also to add to that, that connection to the past, but also the connection to the present and the future. And the reason I say that is because the Descendant African American family associated with this site, one of the things they used to do was have periodic memorial services on the property. So they would have them just for their family, and they would invite us, being the archaeology office, to come and, display some of their family artifacts for them to look at, and for some of the family to remember actually excavating some of them. And so we would be there, in addition to our Black History office, would be there also, to give out information, everything, since they were also involved in the very, very beginning with this site. But that was one of the things that was always so moving at these services, at these memorial services, is that they wanted all generations of their family to be there to celebrate, where they are, to celebrate, all different parts of life, right? And to also let the younger generations know how important a site like this is, how important it is to remember this, how important it is, in the future and stuff like that. So it always was really, it was just amazing to see, those connections that the family was doing to past, present, and future, and the importance that they saw, with doing this. The woman that actually coordinated these memorial services and these larger family reunions on other properties, she passed away probably more than a decade ago. So the torch has not been picked up to continue. But again, what's interesting is hearing from other family members that are from outside the area and things like that, and how they're finding these connections to this site.
Yeah, and a lot of times archaeology is the only thing that's left of these African-American families' history. Their history didn't get written down. So that's why archaeology is so important for these families.
Yeah, and one of the other things too, just to add on to that, is one of the last times I was on this site. Actually, no, it was a couple months ago that myself and a couple of staff, we started walking around that larger parcel that I showed you in that image, where the main house was, and there were a couple other structures that were found, everything in complete disrepair. That parcel of land is wooded, and up until now, it has not been developed and when I say developed, I mean, like, we have not, the commission, put trails on it. We have not put playgrounds on it. We have not done anything like that. We have kept it in its natural state. One of the primary reasons is because back in the late 80s, when we, being the archaeology office, acquired this property, being where the Northampton quarters are, we found it extremely important to, at that time, tell the history of African Americans through time, because, this hadn't really been done a lot. And so we found that part of history and that connection. I mean, we had the physical structures where people were living for centuries, and, were living as tenant farmers later. So this is the story we wanted to highlight. But what was interesting is a couple of months ago, when myself and two other colleagues were walking through the woods where the other buildings were found, it was on record that only a couple of structures existed in that wooded area. We found those in addition to a number of more. We found potentially almost 10 buildings, or structures, I should say. And this could be a mix of a dwelling house. It could be a mix of a shed, a garage, we don't know. But the potential to sort of expand the story and to expand, where the enslaved or later tenant farmers, where they worked. We have access to this parcel to help build that story. So we'll see what is to come.
Yeah, hopefully more excavation in the future, if that's possible. And this is just a really interesting story. And but I guess maybe we should probably move on to our next site. And that would be Mount Calvert, which was Prince George's County's first county seat. And so Dr. Montaperto, if you could maybe discuss some of the major findings at Mount Calvert.
Okay, well, one of the exciting things about Mount Calvert is, again, it is the first county seat for Prince George's County, but its history or occupation of people go back, 10,000 years, if not a little bit before that. We're still literally unearthing this history to tell that long story. So we know that Native American Indians were first on this property. And actually, I should probably not use the word property, on this land. They were first there. Again, we know it probably goes back 10,000 years or so, and had lived on that property for a long time, for, you know, thousands of years. And then we have this shift of Europeans coming in, you know, American Indians being kicked off their lands, and then, you know, Europeans settling, creating houses, towns, you know, different things like that. And it then became a colonial, it was a colonial town. So it was a colonial town first, and then it evolved to be the county seat of Prince George's. And then it, money and power moved the county seat to Upper Marlboro area. And so the town, you know, sort of existed for a little bit and then went in decline. And then the third major group of people that were there were related to the plantation that was at the site. So you have, you know, you have a large number of enslaved African Americans that were on the property that were doing, you know, the labor to support this tobacco plantation at the beginning. You know, crops, you know, things change later with crops and stuff like that. But you have this rich, rich history of 10,000 years with various different groups of people settling and or forced onto this parcel of property. And one of the, so those projects, we've been doing excavations there since close to when the commission acquired the property in around 1995. So we've been doing excavations there for a very long time. This is our primary public site. So now we are able to better engage with the public. If we're crossing our fingers with COVID, we can do a little bit more interaction with the public with excavations. We had to sort of put that on hold for a couple of years. And now we're, you know, hoping to get that stuff back up again. But currently, the biggest project and biggest thing that we are doing at Mount Calvert is related to restoration work. So we are working on trying to help waterproof the house. So fix the roof, waterproof around the foundation to help preserve, protect the house, the historic house, which dates back to the plantation period. It dates back to the late 1780s, 1790s. And we are trying to do what we can to preserve that house. And that is actually where we have our archaeology museum. So we do not interpret the house in the traditional sense. On the first floor, we actually have an archaeology museum to interpret all of the history that has been found on this site. And I am going to, again, share my screen so I can show you a couple of interesting finds that we have uncovered during the restoration efforts and some other work that we are doing related to getting some telecom work out there. So let me bring this slide up real fast. And so what you are looking at is on the right-hand side is a map of the majority of the property that entails Mount Calvert. The red circle is showing the location of where the historic house is. And the water, and as I'm seeing this image, this is the current image, it looks like it must have just rained. The river looks really muddy in this PG Atlas shot. So what we're looking at, this is the Patuxent River right here. And then this offshoot is the western branch. We do have a dock right where my cursor is, and then there's a little pathway that can move up to the house. But doing some testing in preparation for this restoration work that is to come, we did have to excavate 3 units, 3 pits to the depth of the bottom of the foundation or footers of this house. And in particular, where you see Stephanie right here in the Penn State hat, this unit right here had to go down pretty far because we do have a full basement in the original section of this house. But one of the amazing things is she is right here in this unit, and you can see how far off of the house it is. It's only a couple feet off of the house. In the bottom, where she's standing, she found a living surface that dates to about 1,000 years old. So she found the actual living surface that we have American Indians that were living on at one point. Miraculously, in the construction of the house, it did not completely destroy it. In the process of doing this excavation, we learned that when they were building the basement, it appears, or I'm sorry, the house, when they started in the basement, it appears they were actually building the structure from the inside. So we don't have as much disturbance on those outside walls, which can explain some of it, but still it's remarkable that we still have this intact living surface that's at least 1,000 years old. So that is one amazing thing we discovered just in these 3 units. So needless to say, who knows what's to come when the entire perimeter of the original house does need to be excavated to put in this new drainage system and waterproofing. So more to come with that information. Sorry, went the wrong way. Another interesting thing that we completely did not anticipate is we are currently going to be moving to a new office, and our office will be on this main Mount Calvert parcel. And so last week and this week, staff have been out on site while this work is going on to make sure that there's no disturbance, or minimal disturbance, I should say, to cultural resources. And so in the process of doing some trenching, they found, Stephanie found, she's our senior archaeologist, she found in this one trench, and so this is one continuous trench. I'm just showing you 2 different sections of this long continuous trench. And I have written a red line around here. And hopefully you guys can see how there's a dark stain through here. And this area right in here looks a little like orange or red. You can see a similar appearance over here where I've drawn another sort of half circle and some orange or red. And these appear to be related to the colonial time period and appear to be post holes, structural post holes. So they would be much larger than somebody putting up a fence line. What's peculiar is if we go back here, I'm not going to be able to do this very well, but we'll try. If we go back to this image, and you can see this is the road leading in and toward the historic house. Our new office is going to be right here. Where those post holes were found are on this side of the road. And these are all trees. And then the land drops off to the marsh / water. So they were found where there's not a lot of land on this side, which was very, very surprising to us. Being that these are plowed fields, there's more land here. You don't have that drop off, steep drop off to water. We could more anticipate, structural, posts and things like that here, but to find them on the opposite side is curious. Right now, we did not dig any deeper than this. We left it as is. We told them do not dig any deeper than this, as long as it was to code for putting in their conduit. And so they've laid their conduit, they've backfilled everything, and we've recorded what was found. So we will now have a record of this in case in the future we want to come out and try to see and interpret, what we might have in this area. But what you're seeing with the orange, that's all brick. There's mortar in it. And if I remember correctly, there's some historic artifacts that are popping up. As they continue to the trench today, getting closer to our new office, there were some more stains that were popping up, could be post-hole-ish, but they did not have the same brick and mortar in it. But you have colonial pipes that are popping up, a piece or two of some colonial ceramic. So there's something going on this side of the road, which is definitely interesting to see.
Yeah, so Mount Calvert has a long history, tens of thousands of years, and you showed us some of the examples of that history with the Native American finds next to the house and intact. So, there's still a lot of work to do at this site, and there's still a lot to find. And how many elements of the colonial town have been identified so far? Have you excavated several of the buildings from the colonial town?
We have, and actually, right next to the historic house, we found a structure right next to that we are identifying as a house structure. It probably was an ordinary. So again, for those, here tonight that do not know what an ordinary is, it would be very similar to a tavern of sorts. Somebody for a very cheap price could get a place to sleep, a little something to eat and drink. They would operate as these temporary places for people to come when they came to the town for their court dates and things like that. So there were a number of them at Mount Calvert, and we have found a couple. So there's that one that is right next to the house. Again, it would predate the house. The house would have come much later than this town. So there's one of those structures right next to the house. When you come onto the property, we have found another row of structures. We believe that the town was probably set up with a road and then structures on either side of the road, heading down the lane. And the other structures we have found, one of them we also believe is another house that domestic structure that people would have lived in, that there's a good guess that it also was probably operating as an ordinary. We think it might be associated with a gentleman, he was a merchant, his name was Stoddard. Next to his house, there was a smaller structure found. That one is really, really interesting. It's pretty much abuts his house. And it's really interesting because we have found a conglomeration of multiple ethnicities present there. So we have found objects like Caravaca crosses, which should not necessarily be in this region. So those are probably interpreted as a trade piece or something. So we have found 2 so far. We have a lot of beads and cowrie shells representing an African and or African American presence. And so we're seeing an interesting maybe commingling of like people interacting with each other is probably a better word. So people interacting with each other at this site that could represent American Indian, could represent African or African American, colonial European. So it's really, really interesting. So there are those 2 structures. And then a bit farther, so if anybody has been to the site where you park, there is another structure that we have found that appears to be a storehouse, a very large storehouse. And so those are at least 1, 2, 3, 4 structures that we have fully exposed, elements of those structures to know the dimensions of them. in addition to other areas on the property where we know that there's a presence of, other colonial structures and things like that. But those have not been as fully established as far as the colonial period goes. Then with the plantation period, we had been excavating the area that we believe is where the quarters were and where the enslaved were living. And so we have excavated out in those areas. We have not fully excavated. There's definitely more to find, but we may have come across the location of maybe an overseer's house and potentially 2 living structures. Again, so far the evidence we're finding there for structures related to the plantation period are not with foundations, are not with post holes. These structures where the enslaved were living are probably going to be built on top of the ground. So they're not going to leave tons of imprint on the ground surface. So we have to sort of interpret and figure this out through nails, through glass, through, different objects and items, artifacts that are going to survive longer through time.
Okay, well, we could probably talk about Mount Calvert
Yes.
for an hour. But yeah, I wanted to try to get to maybe at least one more, maybe 2 more sites.
Let's go.
Yeah, so our next site is Cherry Hill Cemetery, which is located in the Riverdale area. And if you could just give us an update on what's happening there and what's going on at this site.
Sure. So Cherry Hill is it's a larger parcel of property. However, a very small section of it is an historic African-American cemetery. The cemetery began in 1884 when Josiah Adams received the property, and it was established as his family cemetery. So the interesting story on this site is that the cemetery was not, this historic site was not owned by the commission. If I remember correctly, a developer had purchased the property. It was under a developer. And as the community was going through various development stages, neighbors started realizing that it appeared that the developer was removing gravestones. And this was, for obvious reasons, very concerning to the surrounding neighbors, and eventually reached out, and eventually it got back to my predecessor, Don Creveling, and he was contacted and began working with the homeowners, the community association there, and to try to figure out what is going on, who is buried here, and just sort of uncover, but not literally, the history of this site. And so through that process of us getting involved, our office getting involved, and it being known what is happening, eventually through a couple of different moving around, because I think it was owned by the county, and then officially it came to the commission. I think, if I'm remembering that correctly. So it is a property. This site, in addition to the other 2, Mount Calvert and Northampton, are the archaeological sites, and or in this case, historic cemetery, that do fall under my office for management and things like that. So they did, when my office first got involved with this site, and it came under the management of my office when the commission acquired this cemetery, one of the first things was to establish or reestablish how many people may have been buried there, where they were. There were some stones that still remained. The stones that were at this site at this historic cemetery were in the tradition of African-American burial practices. So you had, local ironstone that was being used as grave markers. Some of the earlier markers were even in, like cement, concrete, something like that. So it, it had a different appearance and a unique appearance with that. And then also you would see the placement of yucca, the plants, in the location of where some of the burials are. And again, like all of these have different significances to African-American burial practices. And I could go on and on about that another time. Jennifer's good on that too. But one of the things that is exciting that we more recently did, and actually this is the beginning of February, is Tim Horsley came out. And Tim Horsley is a geophysicist that works with archaeologists to help us through non-destructive means, identifying different cultural features that could exist in the ground to help us begin, our study and help us begin to maybe understand a layout of something. And in certain situations, the information that he finds can also help us with figuring out where we may dig. In the case of a cemetery, there's no desire to dig. We just want to locate where people have been laid to rest and not disturb that. So let me show you a picture of some of the work that that Tim was doing. So as you can see, it was one of those days that we got a little bit of snow. Fortunately, that snow did not affect his equipment. So this is Dr. Tim Horsley. And what he is doing is a ground penetrating radar survey where he was walking over the ground with this piece of equipment, and it is helping to detect different signals will bounce off the equipment, and it's helping him to detect, again, through non-destructive means, things in the ground, anomalies, things that are not normal formation. And since he has been doing this for such a long time, and he specializes in doing this for archaeologists, he has gotten really good at reading, below ground without actually having to dig through it. And so that is what he's doing there. And you can see there's a little, it looks like a light on top. That's his fancy unit that is tied into GPS. So that is helping him with also mapping the site as he goes along. You can see a line here, that's his tape, and that's to help him with his transects. So he knows where he is in space on the property. So it helps him with his mapping. Right now, I don't have a lot of information to share. We are still in the draft phases of this. I have received a draft report of how this information looks, and we're still reviewing that draft. So I'm waiting for final report to come, hopefully soon. But what I can say is that this was very successful project. He was very pleased with the results. So ground cooperated, equipment cooperated, and what I can let everybody know is he was able to locate additional burials that we did not see, that were not marked above ground. So again, more information to come as all that information gets finalized, the data gets finalized. But amazing way to use technology through keeping everything in place and helping us to better interpret and understand a site.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Kristin.
Yeah.
So Donna, do we have enough time to, or I mean, we could talk about another site, or do you want to do questions?
You're muted.
You would think I'd know this with doing it at the office all the time. Sorry. We have 2 questions. So why don't we get the questions quick, and if we have time, we'll go ahead and do your last site. So the first one is from Charles Hendricks. Is the larger parcel where the Northampton Mansion House was located still called the Lord Fairfax Historic Site, as it is on my perhaps 20-year-old ADC atlas? And is there any interpretation about the Fairfax family's history?
That is a great question. Okay, so first, Fairfax did not acquire that property until 1865. So the majority of the property is interpreted from the time period of the Spriggs. So it was in the Spriggs family from the beginning of that property being granted to Thomas Sprigg Sr. In the late 1600s, and then the Sprigg family owned it all the way up to 1865. At 1865, that's when Fairfax purchased the property, and then they owned it until, for the most part, the easiest way to describe it is who eventually developed it, they developed it. So at the site, what we have is we have 4 interpretive signs. And the signs interpret, there's one in front of each of the quarters. So those interpret the structures, the buildings that you're actually looking at. And they let you know what the building is you're looking at, the significance of the building, the importance of the descendant family in the story. And then the 2 signs that we have at the end of the pathway, we have a couple of benches. And there's 2 signs there that give more of a general explanation of the site, which talks about the early history, and then the Fairfaxes are mentioned in that. But again, that's just sort of like, brief. So they're in the history of the site, but the primary focus on that was the Spriggs and the association with the enslaved and then the descendants who then later were tenant farmers. So hopefully that partially answers it. As far as that larger parcel, we currently as a park basically call that entire entity Northampton. We do not have any signage where the woods are. So there is a walking path, there's a community walking path, and there's no signage letting people know that this also is part of Northampton. So there's nothing like that. All the signage, all the interpretation is just at the quarters. But one of our hopes is to potentially at some point in the future, maybe start increasing that signage and things like that. But again, when my predecessor had, started with this site, it was that African-American story and then those associated with that time period that we're primarily focused on. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay, let me ask the next one. This is from Doug McElrath. Do we have any idea where the county courthouse was located at Mount Calvert?
We wish. I mean, that's the needle in the haystack. So we know that there would have been a jail. We know there would have been a courthouse. We know there would have been a church. We have not found any of those 3 major significant buildings to the town, to the county seats. We have a pretty high suspicion that these structures either fall in the woods that sort of separate commission property or that are in that boundary of commission property / private property, with a really high suspicion that these could actually be on private property. So to date, we have not found them. We have not found any maps that help us hone in on location. We have done geophysical work out there in certain areas. That has not assisted at this point because we were focusing on other things. But if anybody on this call has the missing map that we're looking for, that would be fantastic. We have, the traditional story of, the courthouse burning down, not the one at Mount Calvert, the one in Upper Marlboro. And so, we lost maps, but there has to be more than one. We just keep hoping that somebody in their basement or attic finds that map. But to date, we do not have an official plat of the layout of Mount Calvert. So the only way of the town, so the only way for us to start piecing those things together is through the archaeology that we're doing, and just hoping that sometime we will find it. But yeah, we would love to find the courthouse, the jail, and or the church.
Okay, well, there's no other questions at the moment. So if you want to try in a few minutes to talk about your last property, go for it.
So
We can talk
Kristin,
about the upcoming projects there.
okay, do you have time to maybe just give a brief, discussion of Concord?
Sure. So Concord is in our Walker Mill Park area. It's off of Walker Mill Road, and very close off of, if you take the Ritchie Marlboro exit off of 495, you can get there to Walker Mill Park. And it is an amazing site. It's a late 18th century historic site, but the historic house has gone through many additions to it. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, things have happened to it. And it's just an amazing historic property that has standing structures of various time periods and amazing potential for locating maybe slave quarters, other structures that would have been associated with, the 18th century. And so one of the things to help with the large restoration effort that is happening at this site is we are going to have Tim Horsley, he's our favorite geophysicist, come to Concord to do some geophysical testing. And this time I am saying geophysical because he is hoping to do beyond, and I apologize, very grainy picture, but he is hoping to go beyond ground penetrating radar and incorporate some other geophysical means, again, all of it non-destructive, and to try to just see, what features might be popping up underground. So what we're looking at, here's Walker Mill Road down at the very bottom. Here is the entrance into Concord along here. Here is the historic house. And then off to the side out here in the vicinity is also an historic cemetery associated with some of the family members. So as part of this geophysical study, what Tim is going to be doing is doing some GPR. So again, same method that he did at Cherry Hill around this cemetery that's in this vicinity. And he's going to expand it just a little bit so we can establish potentially how large that family cemetery actually is, because it does go beyond, there is a fence structure around it, and we believe it does go beyond that fence structure a bit. The other thing he's going to be doing is he will be going over a good portion of the front of the property and a good portion of the back of the property. So he will be covering a large section of front and back to, again, see if he can find any historical features. But again, in the process, he's going to find utility. He's going to find other things too. But our hope is to sort of start getting a base knowledge of some things that might be popping up that is going to help us with the restoration efforts, to help us potentially know areas that we might need to further investigate. We might need to be careful of in the process of doing the house restoration and things like that. So that is an exciting project that is coming up. And I believe that hopefully he will be there midsummer to do that. And that's gonna take a couple of days because it's a very large parcel compared to Cherry Hill. So he's gonna be there for a while, and we're crossing our fingers that some good information comes out of it that will help with future potential directions of more research opportunities out at that site.
Okay,
So that's my teaser.
We'll just have to have you come back so you can
There you
share
go.
the story of what he found at Concord.
Yeah.
So I want to thank Kristin and Jennifer for tonight's presentation. I always learn something every time I'm part of these history chats. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us tonight. If you enjoy these chats, consider becoming a society member if you are not already one, or if so inclined, make a donation to the society. Both can be done through our website, www.pghistory.org. Next month's history chat will be on June 27th, entitled Preserving Your History. It will be a conversation with Franklin Robinson Jr. and John Peter Thompson talking about preserving your family history. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and hope to see you next month. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Okay, where do you stop the video?
All right, well